Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Megan Trush, and I'm the Director of Research Partnerships at the Diversity Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the team leading this initiative through ESDC's Workplace Opportunities Removing Barriers to Equity program. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining you today from Toronto, which is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As we come together to discuss equity and inclusion in workplaces, it's important to reflect on the ongoing impacts of colonialism and our responsibility to advance reconciliation across sectors. In today's session, EDI in federally regulated sectors, Understanding and Managing Backlash, it's part of a broader effort to support organizations subject to the legislated Employment Equity Program in strengthening their capacity to create inclusive and equitable workplaces. We know that in today's climate, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives can sometimes encounter resistance or even backlash, whether from within organizations or in response to broader political and cultural narratives. To better understand and respond to these dynamics, I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Wendy Sucure. Wendy is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Ted Rogers School of Management, founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute, academic director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and academic research director of the Future Skills Center. She brings deep expertise in working with organizations across sectors to leverage principles of EDI as a competitive advantage, and will be sharing insights to help us approach this work with confidence. Please feel free to share questions in the Q&A box throughout the session. We'll have time for some discussion following the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Oh, thanks so much, Megan, and thanks to you and Diane and others for helping to organize this. I'm really, really pleased to be here today. And I'm really pleased at the great turnout. I know it's a very busy time of year, and we have lots of people on the line with lots of experience. So I'm really hoping that you will share your comments and not just your questions. Yes, we just got our first question. Will it be recorded and sent out? Yes, it will. And feel free to respond anonymously if that is your desire. So I'm going to share my screen and rely on the team to help with the traffic. So do feel free as I'm going along to add any comments or questions that you would like, and Megan will keep me apprised of what's going on in the chat. So let's start the slideshow. And as Megan mentioned, this is part of a project we've been working on with ESDC, focused on federally regulated organizations. It's worth noting that one of the big successes, in my view, of Canada's employment equity legislation, which was introduced in 1986, is that when we look at communications, transportation, financial services in general compared to other sectors, they tend to be ahead of the curve with respect to representation, because what gets measured gets done. And we know that organizations that have been required for, what is that, almost 40 years to track representation in their workforce have actually made significant progress. But we want to talk about where we are, what some of the challenges are, and how we can move forward. The only thing I want to say about the Diversity Institute that's sort of germane to the conversation is we are big. We have 80 full-time staff, but we're in the business school. And so while our commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion does stem from a commitment to human rights and social justice, we're really preoccupied with how equity, diversity, and inclusion helps drive organizational performance. And that's whether you're a financial institution, Air Canada, Starbucks, Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, the City of Markham, or the regional municipality of Cape Breton, and everything in between. We think it's pretty clear that as Canada's changing, your strategies have to change when it comes to recruiting talent, when it comes to developing products and services, and so on. And because we run a couple of very large, well, more than a couple, we're the research lead for the Future Skills Center. We're also the lead for the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and the Inclusive Innovation and Entrepreneurship Network. And we've done projects for Toronto Regional Real Estate Board, and so on. We have some insight into consumer perspectives on financial services, transportation, and communication sectors. And it from our perspective, is simply good business. And, I often say that when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, in my view, it's marketing 101, because the basic premise of marketing is you segment your market. And we know Canada's markets are changing. I mean, women have more influence. There's still wage gaps. There's still issues around underrepresentation, but we're more than half of university graduates now. We make the majority of purchasing decisions, and we have more wealth than ever before. We know that Indigenous youth are the fastest growing segment of the population, and we know Indigenous people with university educations have the same employment outcomes as non-Indigenous people. The problem is not enough Indigenous people have graduated from post-secondary institutions, and so there's lots that needs to be done there that we're working on through the Future Skills Center. We also know that while all workforce growth will come through immigration, we are not doing as good a job as we should on creating pathways for immigrants, particularly highly skilled immigrants, in the workforce. And one of the stats that always sticks in my mind is when you compare Canada and Australia. In Australia, after 5 years, most immigrants in the big 6 professions, I think, like accounting, physician, lawyer, I forget the list, will earn 90% of what an Australian-born accountant, engineer, physician will earn. In Canada, it's 50%. And we have acute shortages in healthcare. We have acute shortages. We just did a session with Electricity Canada on the electricity sector, huge shortages in skilled trades and engineering and so on. And yet we are underutilizing immigrant talent. And in the current environment, where we know immigrants are more likely to be entrepreneurs and they're more likely to export to exactly those markets the Prime Minister is trying to break into. Immigrants are really our competitive advantage, in my view. And for financial institutions, obviously, they're a critical source of potential customers. Obviously, have a huge impact on air travel and other forms of transportation and so on. So, we can go through each one of these stats and ask ourselves, what are the implications of the changing nature of the Canadian population for your talent strategy, for your product and service development strategy, for your innovation strategy, for your globalization strategy? And that's something we do a lot of. We also know that the proportion of the population that's racialized is increasing quite dramatically. The proportion of the population that identifies as having a disability is increasing significantly. 27% of Canadians now identify as having a disability. And that's partly because of the aging population, right? And also a broader definition of what a disability is, to include episodic disabilities, mental health, cognitive differences, and so on. And when I see this stat, I am reminded of something the late David Onley, our former lieutenant governor, said, and this would be probably 15, maybe even more years ago. He said at that time in Ontario, 17% of Ontarians identified as having a disability, but 55% indicated that an immediate member of their family had a disability. And I don't know about you, but I'm very acutely aware of how, for example, people on the autism spectrum are treated because of one of my family members. I'm acutely aware of how we support caregivers of people with dementia because of experience that I've had. And so if you think about that, if you're a marketer and you're just, crunching the numbers, you can think about the 27% of people with disabilities who are a clear and very diverse segment of the market. But then you can also think about their families because they really care about how your organization treats persons with disabilities. They may be in the market for supports and services for family members with disabilities. So I think it's, as I said, to me, EDI, focusing on equity, diversity, and inclusion is just marketing 101. And similarly, when we know an increasing percentage of young people identify as being part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, we also know that a growing percentage of them identify as allies. So, and I would say that's true of the population generally. So while I may not be trans, my child may not be trans, my best friend may not be trans, I have an awareness of how people treat the trans community, and that shapes my view of organizations. So when we think about, as I said, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and why this is important and why this continues to be important, marketing 101. So as Canada's changing, the talent pool is changing. As Canada's changing, the markets are changing. As Canada's changing, we have opportunities to exploit differences to foster creativity and innovation. And we know that organizations that do a better job with equity, diversity, and inclusion and create healthy workplaces tend to have happier employees, employees who will stay, and employees who are more productive. And if that's not enough, we know that there are also legal and reputational costs. And despite the blowback, and I will talk about backlash in a moment, but despite the backlash, the majority of American business leaders still subscribe to the notion that equity, diversity, inclusion really has more to do with their business imperatives than anything else. And I mentioned generational differences. I mean, now we have a massive youth unemployment problem, so maybe young people are not going to be as discerning, but there's no question that the younger generation is far more concerned with goal and values alignment in the workplace than previous generations were. I do a lot of work with entrepreneurs and focused on innovation, and I was the vice president of research and innovation, so I've worked with lots of startups. Critical to understanding that an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens is important in the design and development of your products and services. And while these examples are much more tied to consumer products, you can extrapolate to the products and services that you offer. And we've seen lots of examples, for instance, of investors missing the mark. And, SheerTex is one of my favorite. I know that the company, there are issues with it now, but one of my favorite stories because the founder was pitching her product to a group of men investors. And they all went, oh, don't get it, don't understand, no. And she had a lot of no's before I think it was H&M invested multiple millions of dollars in the company. Her product, for those of you who don't know, is pantyhose that do not run. And so, we've done a lot of work with the femtech sector, for instance, and there's just a whole market there in catering to women. Lots of men investors miss entirely. I also know, because I've worked in the tech sector, that failing to consider equity, diversity, and inclusion in product design initially resulted in voice recognition systems that didn't recognize women's voices. And I still have problems, as do many racialized people, in getting the sensors in taps in washrooms to work, because I don't know what it is with my skin. Maybe it's because I'm a lizard, but often the sensors did not recognize racialized skin. We also know that there's a book called Invisible Women that just collects all of this stuff. Um, More women die in car crashes and are severely injured because crash test dummies um, were based on male anatomy. We know that during COVID, protective equipment often wasn't tailored to women's needs, and so on and so forth. And one of my favorite examples in the health sector is one Kwame McKenzie talks about, which is during COVID, infection rates in the Black community in Toronto were 7 times everyone else. And that has to do with socioeconomic status. It had to do with the fact that Black people were more likely to be in frontline jobs. And it has to do with the history of anti-Black racism, discrimination, and slavery, which affects relationships with institutions. When they developed a targeted program focused on the Black community, working with intermediaries in the Black community, they were able to take the infection rates down from 7 times the overall infection rate to parity. So the impact of considering equity, diversity, and inclusion in product and service design really, in my view, cuts across all sectors. And whether we're educational institutions or healthcare or crown corporations, we did a project recently with the Museum of History.
History. Yeah.
It becomes very important. And so lots and lots of examples of where inclusive design will make a difference. And, because we run the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, we have a bird's eye view on some of the experiences women entrepreneurs have with financial institutions. Women own 20% of businesses and their partners in another 17%. Now, granted, they're smaller businesses, they're in different sectors, et cetera, et cetera. They're 40% of self-employed Canadians. If you're not thinking about the particular needs of women entrepreneurs, and I don't mean, having a program that says, here is the Women in Entrepreneurs Banking program, and we're going to put a few $1 million in there. But you don't have a lens that considers the particular needs and trajectories and sectors that women tend to be in, you're missing a big opportunity. And that the immigrant population, which tends to be more likely to be entrepreneurs, very often don't have credit histories in Canada, and so on and so forth. Another huge segment that a lot of mainstream financial institutions have not well served. So it's important to really consider equity, diversity, and inclusion in the development of services. And we know from the research that many segments of the population won't even approach a financial institution because they expect to be turned down, and that's discouraged borrower syndrome. It's been well documented in the Black community, but applies more extensively, and so on, and so on, and so on. And it's interesting that the recent G8 agreement included very specific provisions Canada signed on to for improving transparency and accountability around financing women in the financial sector. We also know that in that sector, older Canadians are often targeted by unscrupulous and predatory practices. We also know that, cybersecurity threats are not evenly distributed. So it's critically important when you think about designing your your service provision. I, for one, am not a digital native. I have a PhD in information systems. I hate two-factor authentication. I want to talk to a human. And there's still lots of people like me in your customer base. Lots of them have a lot more money than I do, but it's marketing 101. We also know there are issues around managing risks, and these have not gone away. And it's important to remember what Canada's foundational laws, jurisprudence, and norms are in developing equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies. So where are we now? I'm not going to go through this in detail, but we did go into the employment equity reports to pull out some data and just have a look at how things have changed or not in recent years. And what's interesting is in federally regulated sectors, we see progress in some areas and not in others. Transportation sector still has some gaps in terms of the availability of women in the workplace versus the percentage in the sector, or the availability of Indigenous peoples and employment in the sector, or persons with disabilities and so on. However, what we see is within transportation, there has been a significant increase in representation of some of these groups. Indigenous peoples still remain relatively small percentage. The percentage of racialized people, though, has grown significantly since over the last 4 years. I think 2023 is the last data we could find. And the percentage of women is steadily moving up. And that's despite the occupational groups that are in transportation, which include a lot of technologists and technical jobs. Similarly, when we look at management, we're seeing that the percentage of women has increased to about a third, which is significant improvement. And we see racialized people are also gaining ground. When we look at banking and financial services, what's interesting is financial services generally is overrepresenting women and racialized people. However, Indigenous people and persons with disabilities are underrepresented relative to their availability in the workforce. Again, we're seeing progress in the overall representation of these groups, and certainly in terms of management. In fact, financial institutions very close to parity when it comes to women in leadership roles. Communications industry still see some gaps in terms of sectoral representation relative to Canadian availability when it comes to women, but we're seeing they're pretty close when it comes to racialized people. And again, gradual progress in all of those areas, including at the management level. And women are relatively well represented in this sector in leadership roles.
We've got a couple questions in the chat. Do you want to maybe pause for a second?
Sure.
Okay. Patricia asks, when you mention Canadian availability, does it reference to only active populations of these groups?
Yes, it's availability in the workplace. And then there's also a category which is availability in the sector and at the particular level in question. So it's based on Stats Canada census data. So it doesn't say availability in the workforce for women is always 50%. It looks at it based on the sector and people with the appropriate qualifications, education, and so on.
Thanks. Jefferson also makes a great point when he asks, which racialized groups specifically? Do you have a breakdown, as we are not a monolith?
It's a very good point indeed. We use racialized people because currently the employment equity legislation um, defines, they still use the word visible minority because the legislation was written in 86 and it hasn't required disaggregated data. So for the employment equity reports, we don't see the breakdown. However, Stats Canada has now started to disaggregate that data. So now when you look at overall employment rates and the Stats Canada data on sector availability and so on, it is disaggregated by different racial groups. And we tend to see, for example, huge differences between people of Chinese origin, South Asian origin, and Black origin when it comes to representation, leadership, pay, and so on, but not education. So that's something that is very important to track. We're just reporting on what is in the employment equity reports. Now, if you look at some of the individual organizations, we are seeing some trying to get ahead of the curve and including more disaggregated data because there was a committee that reviewed the employment equity legislation and recommended that the Black community be broken out as a unique category and also that we add the 2S LGBTQ plus community. We also have done work looking at disaggregated data. And I'm not sure it's in this deck, but for example, when we looked at leadership roles in the Greater Toronto Area, where half the population is racialized and half the population is white, white women outnumber racialized women 12-1. So it is also important to look at the gender data through an intersectional lens where you look at the differences and experiences of Black women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, and so on. Unfortunately, there are limitations of that data. I hope that answers the questions, but thank you for them.
Yep, that's great. Gail adds further, same for indigeneity, it should be disaggregated data.
Yeah, and again, with Indigenous peoples, it's not. So you can, through Stats Canada, and we have that data, overall, you can look at very different experiences of, for example, Métis people who tend more likely than not to live in large urban centers versus First Nations who are divided between urban centers and on reserve versus Inuit who are more likely to live in the north. And then there are huge intersectional issues there as well. Very, very good points. Anything else?
For the moment.
Okay. So one of the things that we did recently was a survey with Environics, 8 surveys, in fact, each one 5,000 people over, I think we started in about 2020-ish, around experiences of discrimination in the workplace. So it's 40,000 responses. So it's a very big survey and a very big sample. And what it shows is still we see people reporting high levels of workplace discrimination based on race, based on gender, based on age, and certainly based on Indigenous identity. It's almost half of the Indigenous people working in Canada say that they have been targeted by racism. And what is so interesting about this data, and again, we don't have it broken down specifically for financial services, but we do have it broken down based on public sector, private sector, and nonprofit sector. And what really surprised me, frankly, was the fact that, with the exception of gender, experiences of discrimination in the public sector and the nonprofit sector are higher than in the private sector. And there are a lot of explanations potentially for this. Private sector has more formal processes, they have more resources, they may hire fewer people in these categories. Nevertheless, there's often the assumption that the nonprofit sector is very inclusive, and the evidence does not support that. And similarly with the public sector, there are huge gaps as well. So I'll pause there. Any questions about that?
Yes.
Or comments?
I see. Patricia again says, will we get a copy of the PowerPoint presentations as it's very rich in data? Yes, we will.
Sure. And we have tons of other stuff as well that we're more than happy to provide, because as part of the WORBE project, we produced a number of quick snapshots of what's going on in different sectors. For example, we're also working with individual organizations within the sector on very specific projects to try to address gaps that they've identified and want some help with. So more than happy to share not just the slides, but also the some of the reports we're referring to.
Another comment in the chat, we assume there is little or no discrimination in the nonprofit sector. Yeah.
And we also did a big project with Civic Action, as well as our Diversity Leads project, where we actually collected the data on representation. And while women tend to be better represented in the nonprofit sector in leadership roles, that is not true of other populations. And women in the nonprofit sector, especially those who are in fundraising type roles, experience horrific levels of discrimination, sexism, and harassment. So the sector again is not monolithic. You've got big, well-established agencies like the United Way, you've got little tiny organizations, you've got professional organizations, and so on. So the sector is not uniform, but I was really surprised, frankly, at this and look at the nonprofit sector and discrimination based on Indigenous identity, right? 64%. So I wanted to talk about backlash because one of my big concerns, not just as a researcher, but as a person, is the spillover effects of some of the stuff that's gone on in the US and the results that it's had on Canadian discourse. And so I think it's really important to remember that in Canada in particular, the drivers for supporting equity, diversity, and inclusion programs pretty consistent, and were accelerated by big social movements that came out of the Me Too movement, the murder of George Floyd, and frankly, the discovery of the unmarked graves in Kamloops, I think really redoubled efforts to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. We saw the creation of the Black North Initiative and lots of other things. There have been shifts in legislation. Bill C-25, which came about partly as a result of our work, covers federally regulated distributing companies and requires that they disclose representation on their boards. This was not a requirement previously. Navdeep Bains introduced that legislation, and they have to reveal gender, race, indigeneity, and disability. So it parallels exactly what is in the employment equity legislation. There are still gaps. Before she left, Senator Almodvar, for example, was trying to get reporting requirements in for the charitable nonprofit sector for the reasons I've explained. And I'll mention that Senator Donna Dasco is tabling legislation to require political parties to disclose representation in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So currently, the employment equity legislation only applies to a relatively small percentage of employers, And I think people who are committed to the notion that what gets measured gets done are trying to ensure that it's more widely applied. So there is activism around that. And we've also seen prominent leaders stand up and say, this is not about wokeness. This is not just about social justice and human rights. This is about good business. Nevertheless, we have seen deliberate, well-organized political opposition, and I can go on and on and on about this. Even in Canada, if you dig into the inquiry into foreign interference, you will find that some of the foreign-funded influencers who are viewed as being part of that foreign interference really really went hard on anti-immigrant sentiment and spreading all kinds of um, false information about immigrants in an effort to drive dissension. In the US, of course, there were shifts in the courts around affirmative action, horrifying um, claims and statements that, in my view, really legitimize bad behavior. And the reality is, in tough economic times, people often look for someone to blame or scapegoat. What I would say happened as well is we saw a lack of leadership, especially around the immigration discussion. I mean, it was after the immigration levels were cut that a lot of businesses were going, what? Where are we going to find the workers? And in fact, quite hilariously, a group of Quebec-based small medium enterprises are suing the federal government for cutting temporary foreign workers because they say it's going to severely affect their business. So we did see, especially in the US, some corporations scaling back their EDI initiatives. And sadly, I think a lot of Canadian corporations, some, I won't say a lot, some Canadian corporations, particularly those doing business in the US or of a particular orientation, have also scaled those back. And we've seen this with environmental things as well. So I'm not sure what the state is of all financial institutions in Canada, but certainly RBC and BMO have said they're reframing their EDI efforts. But it's important to remember that our foundational legislation has not changed. We do not have a constitution that would allow the prime minister to make massive changes through executive order. And, you know, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is clear. The human rights legislation is clear. And it's not just at the federal level, it's at the provincial level. Employment equity legislation, Pay Equity Act at the federal level and the provincial level as well. You know, the AODA legislation, the Accessible Canada Act, and a very extensive history of jurisprudence has not changed. And so organizations, in my view, that scale back their EDI efforts in any significant way are putting themselves at risk. And what was interesting was a prominent tech exec in Canada came out against equity, diversity, and inclusion, kind of echoing some of the stuff that was going on in the States, the bro masculine energy culture. And what happened in Canada was 200 founders, executives, and investors immediately stood up and said, not on our watch. Because again, their feeling was that equity, diversity, and inclusion was core to their businesses. We also saw a lot of shareholder activism when anti-EDI proposals came forward at annual boards, and not just in the US, but in Canada as well. And it's really important, I think, to make sure that we distinguish between the rhetoric and the reality, and to understand that backlash is not new. And I'm old enough to remember Susan Faluti's book, and I think it was 91, which really looked at the backlash against the feminist movement and what happened there. And you look at the US civil rights movement, there was backlash. You look at the to us LGBTQ plus rights movement, there was backlash because the pendulum swings and then it swings back. But the reality is Canada's foundation is very strong. The other thing that I think is worth noting, because I assume lots of folks on the call are actually, and I know this from some of the questions we got, are actively working on equity, diversity, and inclusion. I would say that if we made any errors, we may have made the error of thinking that we were talking only to people who agreed with us, and we may have minimized or dismissed opposing views or people who were on the fence. And I really like this this quote that was cited in I think it was a master's thesis. I've learned that if you're hunting bear, you have to think like a bear, and I've had to understand people's fears. I've had to understand their anger in order to make it my friend. For me, what is really important is not preaching to the converted, but finding ways to talk about these issues that will resonate with people who don't live and breathe EDI. Because otherwise, we run the risk that they will be influenced by the rhetoric and the false claims and the hate speech, frankly, that is spewing over the border. So, this is my gift to all of you. Again, Environics survey, 5,000 respondents, and it was done. I think the data were collected in March 2025. The question was simple. Is EDI at work a good thing or a bad thing? 16%, 16% said EDI at work is a bad thing. 54%, more than 3-to-1, said it's a good thing. And a bunch of people were on the fence. So in Canada, the prevailing sentiment is that equity, diversity, and inclusion is a good thing in the workplace. Now, why would that be? Well, think about it. Half of the workforce is women. A quarter of them identify as having a disability. Between 25 and 30% are racialized. And while the percentages of people who identify as having a disability or identify as Indigenous is quite small, there are many allies who are concerned about truth and reconciliation, who are concerned about accessibility in the workplace, who have immediate members of their family who need inclusive supports. So please remember this, 3-to-1, 3-to-1
We've got
employees
some
support
comments
for
and
EDI.
questions.
Sorry?
I said we've got some comments and questions if now's a good time.
Sure.
Okay. There was one question. It came up a little bit earlier, but we moved on to the next slide. But it was about the Environics data, and it was: do we know if Jewish is included in race ethnicity in this discrimination in the discrimination stat that you had cited?
I don't think we included religion at all, but let me just check. Oh, we did. Yes, we included religion.
Yep.
So if we went back, and I have to go back and see if we also have data on people who identified as Muslim or Jewish or Christian or agnostic or whatever, so that we could disaggregate this further. But yeah, the Environics survey did look at religion, but would not have included that with race or ethnicity. But we could pull, like we looked at the big ones. So we looked at race in that slide that compared private sector, public sector, nonprofits. I pulled the big ones, but we could pull the data and look at whether there are differences in terms of religion as well. This was just 4 of the categories, but we collected more data than that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, the next question or comment and then a question is: curious that social justice and basic human rights isn't a driver for most businesses. Why do you think that is?
Quite honestly, I mean, some businesses do have culture, statements of culture and value where those things would be embedded and who kind of mainstream corporate social responsibility and so on. So I don't at all want to minimize that. But the reality is businesses' primary goals generally are to make money. And so my point is not that those things aren't considerations, but they're often not the main driver. And that's why, from our perspective, if you can show organizations, regardless of their political orientation, regardless of where they are on the spectrum in terms of socially responsible or not, if you can show them that commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion are aligned with their overall business goals, you will be more successful than if you approach it with a um, um, more based on moral judgment and ethics. Although I personally think those things are important, I think some people don't listen as carefully as when you talk about markets and making money and attracting and retaining employees. But folks on the call work in businesses, so I'm sure they know what resonates. So it isn't to suggest those things aren't important, and obviously they're fundamental human rights, and in Canada, at the provincial level, the federal level, and internationally, if you operate globally, that you cannot afford to disregard. But for me, especially in the current environment, I see as the principal driver, how do we make money? How do we perform? How do we succeed? And that's where I'm always looking for the links between good equity, diversity, and inclusion policies. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. We've got about 10 minutes left. Would you like more questions or would you like to get through the slides?
Are there more questions?
There's a couple. There's a
Let's
couple.
take the couple of questions, and I can always go through the slides quickly, and folks can have copies of them, so I don't need
Okay,
to.
perfect. I wasn't sure how many more slides you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had a couple of comments about the many organizations affiliated with the United States made their Canadian counterparts change language as well. That was something we saw a bit of, particularly in the first part of this year. There was one question about, are these surveys done by the Diversity Institute?
No, the surveys are done by the Environics Institute. We, in some cases, fund them with the Future Skills Center. And in some cases, we've funded them through the Diversity Institute. But the research is conducted by the Environics Institute, and that's why they're large, stratified samples and, verifiable results.
The next question I've got is, can you speak more about shareholder advocacy efforts as part of the larger corporate social responsibility sphere, and whether you have any additional examples about how it could be an impactful method of intervention or teaching in this space?
I think that's a really good point. It isn't something I know very much about, but um, it would be worth having a conversation about at some point. It isn't something that I've really looked at carefully, but I would think that um, the Governance Professional Association of Canada, for example, might have more information on how that works. And certainly we've seen shareholder advocacy be very important in the past around other social justice issues, whether the environment or, investing. I'm old enough to remember when investments in South Africa, for instance, were something that shareholders forced divestiture of, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no question that can be an effective strategy. It's just not something I've been very active on.
Thank you. A couple more questions on the survey. The first is whether it was done across provinces.
Yep,
especially Quebec due to Bill 21.
yep, yep. Stratified sample, and we do have the Quebec results broken out. As you might expect, there are some differences with Quebec, particularly when it comes to issues around race. So that I can't remember the breakdown. It's still a significant majority of people in Quebec who say that EDI is, at work is a good thing, but it's not as high as it is in the rest of Canada.
And what are your thoughts on the tech industry using the K-1 visa in the US and temporary work permits in Canada as a method to employ qualified workers at a lower, I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. Um,
At a lower rate.
yeah.
There's no question that we still have a lot to answer for in terms of how we treat temporary foreign workers, newcomers, et cetera, et cetera. And, there have been some very bad examples of exploitation using some of these mechanisms. I'm most familiar with the examples with temporary foreign workers, but I'm sure it's across the board. And I do think, for me, what's important, because I'm the child of a refugee, I'm very clear on where I stand on issues around immigration and humanitarian pathways. And I do a lot of work with refugees as well as economic immigrants. So I'm a big proponent in trying to find ways, whether it's for international students, temporary foreign workers, economic immigrants, whatever, to create pathways. And I am someone who would err on the side of being generous as opposed to miserly in terms of where we set our targets. But regardless of whether you set the levels higher or low, we have to make sure that there are protections for people and that they're not being exploited. Like the predatory practices at post-secondary institutions for international students were horrific. You know, taking lots of their money for programs that were leading them nowhere, imaginary job training programs, bridging programs that didn't work, and so on. So post-secondary institutions don't get a pass on this either, but we do need to make sure those protections are in place.
Thank you.
Any others, Megan?
Um, a few people are asking if we'll share the findings of the survey. Yes, we will be sending a follow-up package with all sorts of lovely
Yeah.
information for you.
And the other thing I would say is that if somebody wanted the data on Quebec, for example, feel free to write to us. And if we can do something simply, we're happy to, it's just a matter of pulling the data out of the files. If it's something complicated, we can't. But if you have specific data questions, more than happy to take them offline and just send us a note because we're here to help.
I'll
Okay.
I'll drop my email in the chat so that everyone has it.
So 4 minutes left. I just wanted to quickly share our approach to driving change. So there are no simple solutions to complex problems. And the barriers, whether to women or racialized people, Black people, Indigenous people, and so on, operate at different levels. So at the societal level, we know bias, stereotypes, the media, infrastructure. We just did a project on Indigenous women in Northern tourism, and their number one barrier wasn't access to financing, it's access to the internet. There are Indigenous communities where there's not running water. How can you focus on education and employment if there's no running water? And so on and so forth. So there are a lot of big societal level issues, policy issues that we have to grapple with. The organizational level, as I said at the outset, my bias is towards ensuring an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens is embedded at every layer of your corporate strategy. And we've worked with enough different corporations, probably over 400 now, to feel fairly confident in saying that that works reasonably well. And then, of course, at the individual level, we all make choices every single day about things that can build an inclusive culture or take it down. And so, at the societal level, like our national childcare policy is a game changer for women. Um, Employment equity and so on, critically important. And we really feel like challenging stereotypes is key as well. And we have campaigns called See It, Be It to profile um, non-traditional groups in successful stories. I said at the outset, like our view is that equity, diversity, and inclusion is not just an HR issue. It's not just a values and culture issue. It's not even just a governance and strategy issue or a matter of tracking, although, I'm a big believer in the employment equity legislation and the fact that what gets measured gets done. We have to think about it through the entire value chain, through your procurement policies, through your product and service design, through the implementation, sales and support, because as the population's different, so are those things. And when it comes to outreach and expanding the pool, we need a long-term view. We need to think about the next generation of Indigenous workers. We need to think about building pathways. From our perspective, tone at the top matters, human resources matters. Looking at organizational culture is key. Measurement is important. And we have lots and lots. We have a playbook that outlines all this stuff. So I'm happy to make it available. But from our perspective, the thing I want to leave you with is that we are not the 51st state. And we do have solid foundation, institutions, laws, and culture which really reinforce the commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Are some people going to backslide? Sure. We've seen some of that at all levels of government and across sectors. But the fact remains, is Canada's changing, so do your strategies at every level. And there's lots and lots of evidence to reinforce the importance of equity, diversity, inclusion, and organizational success. It's not just the data, it's also the stories, because we have to win hearts as well as minds. And, the final point is in some ways the most important: culture eats strategy. And each one of us plays a role in building our organizational culture as well as our national identity. So with that, I will say thank you very much. And back to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. Your reflections on the complexity of navigating backlash while staying committed to meaningful equity work gave us all a lot to think about. To everyone who joined us, big thank you for taking the time to be part of this important conversation. I know it's not always easy work, especially in moments when the value of EDI feels contested, but it's precisely in those moments that thoughtful leadership and collaboration matter the most. This webinar is part of a broader series of activities that we're delivering through the WORBE program that I mentioned earlier, focused on supporting federally regulated employers and strengthening their equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. If you are a representative of a LEAP employer and want more information, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. I've also put my email in the chat for if anybody had any follow-up questions. We'll be sending the slides, we'll be sending some additional links and resources that you can use in the next couple of days. It'll probably be next week at this point. But thank you once again for being here. And until next time, keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.